and it puts one at risk. And so,
all right. Good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Edge in Taos, New Mexico. Starting a new oil painting. This one, still debating on a title and actually the entire content and exactly the angle and light I'm going to portray it in. But I've decided to go ahead and start. Why not? I've got some sap green mixed up with some liquid and quite a bit of linseed oil as a base coat color, and then some white to start maybe playing with form, light, and shadow. So here we go.
Virtually at all times.
Well, in the book, they risk their lives for the children.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that, the implication is that in some way they've been able to extend this care out to the children because they have formed a relationship with one of them, Nuria, who has for, many seasons been playing with them and interacting with them and building a kind of friendship with them. And so on the foundation of the relationship that they had with this man before, they have a reason to extend that care to an interspecies level.
You begin your chapters with these supposed passages from, what is it called, Diary of a Burned Village, if I remember correctly. Just before I ask you some specifics, what were you doing with that? What were you trying to do with that?
I wanted to show how we speak through writing with the dead. And there is this way in which, so long as we are not forgotten, we're able to kind of inscribe ourselves on other people. There's a way too in which each one of us is just a collection of all of the voices that have come before us, right? And all of the inscriptions that have been made on us. And so this was a way for me of showing how it was possible for that man, who was nameless, right, in the book, to somehow survive and pass on some of his ideas to the children, who will take them up in their own ways. For me, kind of the way that writing works in general. I mean, it amazes me every time, for example, that I pick up Thucydides and find that someone can speak to me clearly and as if they were completely modern from a time so long ago and a context so completely different from my own. And that kind of clarity that writing allows, that ability for the dead to speak and be alive in the world with us, I think is also one of the core elements of human existence. One of the things that makes us extraordinary and the things that give us great power is that intergenerational ability to engage in exchange with other minds in a very direct way through reading and writing, and now, of course, through other means of recording and things like that. We, as a species, are able to access the knowledge of people who disappeared from the face of the earth thousands of years ago. And if we can sustain interest in those exchanges, it has the ability, I think, to make us extremely wise about the decisions that we make in the world. We can continue to learn and amass knowledge in a way that other species really cannot. Right? That is something that we have that other animals really do not have, is writing and inscription beyond just DNA and immediate physical culture and that kind of thing.
It was interesting, Hannah Arendt, when she writes about what constitutes absolute evil or the capacity to commit evil, says it's rootlessness, it's the loss of the connection, any connection to the past at all, a kind of willful illiteracy.
That sounds right to me. I would say that rootlessness, the inability to perceive oneself as connected to the rest of the world, is what creates the psychotic map of the world that is evil, right? When one sees the world as a place from which to draw exploitatively for one's own benefit, and thinks that that is a structure worth following, then one becomes capable of doing great evil, right? I call it extractive individualism in some of my work. It's this sense that you as a self are capable of drawing from the world without consequence, right? There is no limit to what you can take, and there is no responsibility really to give back. And when you start structuring things that way, you get things like the structure of corporations that limitlessly take from the environment in the name of profit, and many other structures that are poisonous to life on Earth. So yeah, I agree. Rootlessness, you could call it disconnection, right? From the other, from the past, from the world. Any sort of misinterpretation of just how incredibly mutually dependent everything is will lead to wrong choices and evil.
Well, you just described the pathology of Donald Trump and almost everyone around him. I want to read this passage and have you comment. Animals have smell, sight, hearing, all the senses we have, but also senses we do not. Ways of knowing we humans have no name for, senses we have lost or neglected, senses we never had. That's, you honor that kind of those senses, those customs, whatever you want to call it, within the Crow community, which are finally to us mysterious.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a way in which, I was having a recent conversation about this too. There's this Thomas Nagel essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And it's a famously misread essay in many ways, because many people have summarized this essay as saying, you can't know what it's like to be an animal that finds its way through sonar, right? And in the dark, it's impossible to place one's mind within this sensory apparatus of the other and experience the world like that. But the interesting thing is that essay has become one of these things that nobody reads, but everybody quotes from, right? And in fact, that essay, interestingly enough, says that there is a way to partially access what it's like to be a bat. And that blind people do this. That they actually use sound to locate objects in a space. And that even people who are sighted, if they pay close enough attention, can begin to have this sense from the way that sound waves move in a space of where things are, even in the dark. And therefore we can start to approach not a perfect understanding of what it's like to be a bat, but some kind of an idea, a starting place of finding mutual ground with what that might be like. I think that this is actually what all communication is, to one extent or another, right? I don't know what you are thinking right now. I haven't experienced what you've experienced in your life, and I can't quite understand what my words and my presence, my appearance, all of those things really mean to you. Because you're an individual, and as an individual, you can't be completely like me. But using my empathy and my sense of what is mutual between us, I can find common ground with you and be confident that we can have a conversation and find mutual understanding. And the same is true with, let's say, moving away from human relationships, animal relationships, or humans' relationships with animals. People say, we don't understand what animals are saying, we can't speak their languages. But human beings who own dogs and cats know that you do speak a language with them.
Yeah, right, please.
Communication happens. They understand you,
She's
you
got the garage
understand
door
that
opener. She
you
hears
exchange
the door.
information about your
Whereas I
condition,
find
you
myself
exchange
just being able
care
to open it.
and love and all of these things with them. You have a rich communication
Alright.
with them.
So,
And
how's
so,
that time?
while it might not be possible for you to know what it's like
Oh, that's
to
coming
be a
together
dog,
pretty quick. That was
for
10 minutes.
example,
Alright, my aperture's a little
you
dim.
know when your dog is happy,
There we
and
go.
you know when it's unhappy. You know when
There
your
we
dog
go.
feels
It's a little
loved and when it needs a bit more love from you. You know when it's hungry and when it's thirsty.
Vary the
it needs to
color
go
in the
outside
background a
and
little.
go to the bathroom. You know
Just
these
to
things.
separate the
And-
figures
and
from
so,
the ground. And
people who work with horses intimately
try
know
to
the
yellow
wounds
lights.
of horses, right? And people who work with any animal come to perceive what the animal perceives in the world very well, to interpret and translate it across that gap of perception. And I think to be fair to how hard it is to understand animals, we need to also remember how hard it is to understand one another and just how difficult human communication can be, you know. One of the things that I got, when The Mountain and the Sea came out, some people were disappointed with how difficult it really was to communicate with the octopus, right? And I remember having this conversation with someone saying, well, I really wanted, there to be this breakthrough moment at which we suddenly come to understand everything that they're saying. And I said, well, you can't even understand what your own mother is saying half the time to you, right? So how are you going to understand what an octopus is trying to tell you? We can't even understand what we're, saying to one another half the time. So there's this sort of coming back to that idea, we're always in the dark to some degree with other people, other animals, other beings in the world. But we can find something in common with them, and we can move to having some kind of a communication with them. It's perfectly possible, and we do it all the time. We just neglect to think about how much we do.
There's another passage, you write, they had not been children, any of them, and they had not been adults. They had been the kind of human survival makes, an ancient state of being in which they were bound to others for heat, food, shelter, and safety in ways the modern human had stopped recognizing, bound together in the old ways with every moment, one of total reliance on the other, bound in a way in which words like friend or family made no sense. Child, adult, friend, family, those were the modern words made for a modern world. For civilization, what really meant a world carved out of nature, like a little dollhouse, an artificial world, with the natural painted and papered away, where each person lived in their own decorated box of a room, where distance from one another was possible and true relationship fell away. I love that. But just explain, a little bit the thoughts behind it.
I think we should remember that childhood and adulthood are modern inventions. These are modern concepts that we have pretty arbitrarily and differently in different societies applied to human beings. There's really no such thing as a child, in the same way as there's no such thing as an adult. We are simply people learning and growing at all stages of our lives, and there's no moment when we're, let's say, in our late teens or early 20s when suddenly we know what we need to know to survive and we can go out on our own. We continue to learn over our lifetimes, and children also have capacities that they don't have to exercise in the modern world, but they're perfectly capable of exercising. Children used to work, right, on farms and do the kinds of labor that we think only adults capable of, and they luckily, I would say luckily, no longer have to do. We've carved out a space for childhood, but we've also carved up the human experience into these little boxes, and we've gotten away from a primal sense, you might say, of togetherness that isn't cut up into arbitrary relationships like friend or family or these kinds of things and labeled. And I think sort of when I was writing this in this moment, I was thinking about the difference between human beings many thousands of years ago, huddled for warmth in a space of shelter together, and how they would have thought of all of those faces around them, around the fire, and what those relationships were like. I don't think those relationships were anything like our modern relationships. They were relationships of total trust and total dependency with one another, in which every day's survival relied on all of those faces around them,
where shadows might be.
Around that earth.
Time, 13 minutes left.
And they must have, of course, had their disagreements and all of those things, and certainly sometimes violent ones, but they knew that they had to be together, and they had to rely on each other. And in the forest, these children are returned to that state of having to be totally reliant upon one another and together, with society and civilization stripped away from them. The wallpapered room. I think about some of these lonely farms when I think about civilization. I think about a farmhouse, let's say a Victorian farmhouse, right, with wallpaper in all the rooms, and it's very pleasant, and they've got glass in the windows and all these things, and they've moved it all by like train out to the middle of nowhere, and all around them is this vast and eternal prairie, right? Completely wild still and unexplored. And it feels to me like that still really is what civilization is. It's this kind of being inside a painted box and trying to ignore what's out there. And when you can't ignore what's out there, if you don't have the technology to cut it off from you and create this artificial space of civilization, you also can't ignore how reliant you are on everyone around you. All of those people around the fire.
There's one last passage I want you to comment on. And as with people, so with whole nations, the Soviet Union fought the Nazis off and then slammed the door shut across all of Eastern Europe to keep their enemies out. Then they got to work weeding out from their collective memory all the things that were hurtful and inconvenient to official history, tearing up by their roots the memories of the Stederlack, I may have mispronounced that, of the Pale, of the millions of prisoners of war, of the nations who allied themselves with the Nazis, willingly choosing Hitler's sadistic, genocidal terror over Stalin's murderous repression and brutality. They rooted out the memories of the incompetent Soviet leadership that led millions to the slaughter, the generals brought back from the gulags, their hands shaking, their teeth rotted by famine to take over the command of shattered armies. After the war, their story, the story of what happened in the forest, would become just one of many stories that could never be told. And on the other side, in the West, she was sure they were doing it too, hollowing out the war so they could fill it with a more convenient story, something with more convincing heroes and more inhumane villains, and the people who lived through a completely different kind of war, the real war, grew more and more silent. Let me just say, as someone who spent a lot of time in war, you totally nailed it.
There's an amazing essay by Lee Sandlin called Losing the War, about World War II and about the silence of the people who fought in World War II. There's an amazing moment in that essay when he realizes that as children, they had gone running around the neighborhood playing army, shooting at each other and falling down and pretending to get killed and all of these things, right outside the windows and under the noses of the men who had fought in the trenches of World War II and who would have been traumatized probably by seeing this, some of them, right? And Lee Sandlin has this sense of us losing the real World War II in favor of the story of World War II that we had been aggressively telling ourselves for a long time. It's a brilliant essay, but it also reminds me of like this personal experience that I had in Turkmenistan, which is I was in a city at the time called Turkmenbashi after the authoritarian president of Turkmenistan, but originally it had been called Krasnovodsk, Red Water, and it was a city on the Caspian Sea. And I was in a taxi and admiring the stone train station of the city, and he said, you like that? That was built by the Japanese. And so was this road. And so were all the apartment buildings in Krasnovodsk. And I said, what do you mean? He said, they were all built by Japanese prisoners of war. They lived here for decades after World War II, and they all died. And they're buried in the cemetery up on the hill. And I said, oh, well, can you drive me to the cemetery? And he drove me there, and there was a monument in the cemetery, relatively new, all in Japanese. And so when I went back to Ashgabat, I went to the Japanese ambassador, and I asked him about it. And he said, yes, there were many Japanese soldiers from the battles in Manchuria who were swept up in the latter days of World War II by the Soviet Union and then worked to death as slave labor all over Central Asia. And recently there was a group of Japanese women who belong to an NGO that goes around and collects the bodies of the dead from World War II, the Japanese war dead, burns them in situ and brings their ashes back to Japan so that they can be buried on Japanese soil. And they are the ones that put the monument up. And I thought, I have no idea what World War II was like. Like, this doesn't fit into any of the narratives of which I have any knowledge. I had no idea, and I was a well-educated person who had actually read many, many books about World War II, that there had even been a battle in Manchuria against the Soviet Union, and that so many hundreds of thousands of people had been captured by the Soviet Union, and none of them had come home. That they had all been worked to death, and some of them didn't die until the 1960s, right? And I got this sense that this colossus, this colossal event of World War II was slipping away in some way, and that we were losing the substance of it and replacing it with something that was much more interpretable and convenient. Because I had never met anyone, who had even spoken about any of this. And then I started sort of talking to other people in different ways about World War II, and I discovered that a lot of my friends who were from Siberia knew Germans after World War II, who never went home, who just were prisoners of war and kept in Siberia for the rest of their lives, rounded up at Stalingrad or other battles on the Eastern Front, and never saw home again. So I really got this sense of the gigantic and unknown, largely lost story of this war, and the deep wounds that it had caused that no one was even willing to speak of anymore.
Well, we tell the stories that perpetuate the narrative or the myth we want, and we erase the others.
Yeah, and there's really no, I guess, advantage to anyone of remembering those Japanese soldiers, right? And so it took just a small NGO group, to go and find them and put up a memorial. But that memorial, I'm sure by now, is largely forgotten as well. 20-some years later, I doubt that very many people in Krasnovodsk would be able to tell you why that's there, even, right? Because their part of the World War II story doesn't have anything heroic or sustaining of a national narrative about it at all, right? And so it will be lost.
Yeah, well, my uncle fought in the South Pacific, came home and drank himself to death because
Yeah.
what they did, the Japanese were horrible, but what they did to the Japanese was just as horrible.
Yeah, and I remember
All of our movies are Saving Private Ryan and stuff.
Yeah. I remember Audie Murphy, his quote where he said, if you train a dog to fight, and then you want to bring that dog home, and give it to your children, you need to untrain it, right?
Yeah, of course.
You need to take the fight out of it, but they didn't do that for any of us. They just said, well, now you're done, go home.
Yeah. Well, that's what the story of the Odyssey is about.
Yeah.
That's what Odysseus has to overcome.
Yeah.
That was great, Ray. It's a wonderful book.
Great.
And I want to thank Diego and Max who produced the show. You can find me at chrisedges.substack.com.
Thank you, Chris.
Alright, well, that's pretty saturated, and I don't think I can do much more to it without fucking it up. Maybe a minute of blending, I don't know. I kind of like the rough, raw brush strokes happening in various places, though. So I think I'm going to use that as the ground for the beginning of whatever this... Oh, shit, that was a horrible shot. Blame that on Chris Edges. Audio ended prematurely. Lost my rhythm. Alright, put this brush away and then I'll wrap this up. We got 2 minutes. Okay. Go here. And here we go. Sounds like a very interesting book. And I still don't know what I'm going to call this painting. So maybe it'll come to me in the time it takes me to take it off the tripod and zoom in on it over here. So, See, I don't want to cast it in an entirely negative light because it's such a complex issue. But I like the notion of it being about the industry of isolation and the way it exploits people's desperation, and how that's perpetuated by the entire capitalist mechanistic worldview and mechanism of its existence. But then again, I can't remember who wrote it, but through all the pettiness and greed, love occurs. That kind of thing. So I wanted to have some more, to be multifaceted. So I'm going to think on the title and cut it here for now. And we'll see how it renders up throughout the process. But I think it's a decent start. It's interesting. So have a good day, Earth. Thanks for watching. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting as of yet untitled.